Okay, let's do this here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my studio. My name's Michael Markowsky. I almost forgot what it was. Today is episode 5 of our Intro to Painting series. And after today's episode, I'm confident you'll know the very basics of painting so that you can begin your journey as a painter. After today's episode, there's going to be another 15 episodes of very simple paintings that anyone can do. Ideally, they've already done the 5 first episodes so that they know all of the basics. But even then, I'm going to do each one of those Tuesday episodes. They're going to be nice and simple for even the most beginner artist to follow along to. But today we are going to be looking at what I and what probably most other professional artists would consider to be really fundamentally probably the most important part of the painting process, which is understanding value. And we are going to do a number of things today. We're gonna talk about what value is and how to modify value, why it's so important, why it's really the forgotten part of the painting process, and why most beginners aren't aware of this. And once you understand how to modify value, you're 10 steps ahead of most other beginners. And then we're going to mix a value scale. And I'm going to mix a number of them. I'm going to mix, I think, 4 of them today. But you could certainly just do one. I don't want to overcomplicate it for anyone. But since I'm doing this, with the idea of eventually making a book out of all these things, I'm going to kind of maybe go a little bit further and just show you a number of different options as we go forward. So you're certainly welcome just to watch the first little bit, and then if you want to continue, I think this might be really helpful for some of the more advanced artists, what we'll end up doing here. So let's understand value. And when I talk about this, I want to talk about value in terms of color theory. Right? There's all sorts of different ways that we can use the term value, but when it comes to color theory, it has a very, very specific meaning, right? And so we're not talking about the value of art in terms of its monetary value, its cultural value, its social value, etc. We're purely talking about value in terms of color theory. So what is value? Value is how light or dark a color can be. And I think the easiest way to just think about it is like a grayscale, like gradients, right? Or paint swatches at Home Depot, right? If you've ever gone to paint walls in your house and you see those little swatches on the wall when you select your colors, that's depending on how those, because different swatches can be organized differently, but essentially they're showing you different values. And I want to show right off the top here, this is a color wheel that we did. It's very similar to the color wheel we did over the past few weeks. So here's your basic color wheel. What I want to do is I want to show you what this color wheel looks like when we convert it to black and white. Because, so for instance, just take a guess here. What is the darkest color on the color wheel and what is the lightest color on the color wheel? And probably you're not going to be too far off, but I bet you're going to be surprised that some other colors might be darker or lighter than you might actually think they are. So you ready? Drum roll. What does it look like? So probably many people would have said, yeah, this yellow right here, or cool yellow, that's the lightest color, right? It's the closest to white. right? And probably a number of other people have been like, yeah, you know, probably one of these blues might be one of the darkest. right? But when we convert it to black and white, we see a number of things. Like, for instance, this cool yellow, you know, arguably, you might even say our magenta, our cool red, might be even lighter than the cool yellow, right? So if we were to put these two colors side by side, they might look like there's a great deal of contrast between those two colors. But in terms of their value, they're almost identical. And we'll talk about why that can be problematic in a little bit here. But I think it's really important for just right off the top for us to see this sort of invisible differences and similarities that most artists are just not aware of. And not being aware of this can cause all sorts of problems in your paintings as we go forward. Right? So again, let's just take a look here. We can see, you know, probably not surprising, our greens and blues are kind of darker. But we can see most of these reds and oranges are almost identical in terms of value, right? Even when we look at some of the versions of them that maybe are a little bit colder or closer to the neutral core, they're also not that different. Right? So we want to understand how to control the value so that we can increase the contrast, right? That's ultimately the goal today, is understanding value so that we can increase the contrasts. So I just want to show a few more versions of these color wheels here, because this is, in terms of color theory, there's different ways to convert an image to black and white, and that's a whole other story, but I think it's just worth just looking. Here's another color wheel that we've looked at in the past, and we convert it to black and white. Basically, we see in the way that it's converted here, really the colors, you know, we have our warm red here and our green at its full chroma intensity, and our blue. These tend to be the darkest ones when it's converted in this way. But for the most part, they're fairly similar in terms of their value level, right? And again, we look here, this magenta is certainly giving our yellow a run for its money in terms of lightness of value. So I think it's important, we're just thinking about here, this at the very bottom, different colors have different values. Right? So even though a yellow might appear to be lighter than a red, depending on which yellow and red you're using, they could be almost identical. Similarly, here's another color wheel that we often see on the computer, and when we convert it to black and white, boom. In this instance, it's the greens which appear to be most dark. And there's, again, if you're really familiar with color theory, there's probably a few of you like, no, green is always the darkest. Not necessarily. Again, it depends on what green it might be. But on the computer, graphic designers might debatably consider green to be one of the darkest colors. And again, we can see a lot of these other colors on the side here, which might appear to be much lighter than everything else, are almost identical, including this yellow, right? That's, I think, was very surprising for me. So not all colors are equal in terms of light and dark, right? I think that's really, really important. So let's just talk about different ways that we can modify a color's value, right? Because if we're looking at that yellow and we're looking at that magenta and we're thinking at first, wow, they're so totally different. And then now we've just seen, maybe not. Maybe they're actually pretty similar. So we want to increase the contrast to create more of a separation in terms of the values in our painting. How do we do that, right? So here's a number of ways to do this. So the first thing, and this is something that I've been advocating for a long time, and those of you that are painting with me for a while, you know that I'm kind of constantly talking about the imprimatur, right? That first layer of color that we add to a painting, right? Putting that on either it's a rusty red, or kind of a brown, or in my case, I've been using for these classes this warm yellow, that is going to imbue every color with a different, it's going to modify the value of every subsequent layer of paint over top of it. And so it's like I'm modifying the color before the color's even been applied to the canvas, right? That's one thing, right? And, well, yeah, I don't want to confuse, but anyway, that's one way of doing it. Another way to modify the value of a color is by painting a second coat of it, or a third or a fourth coat of paint on top of the existing color. And again, those of you that have been painting with me for a while know that sometimes we're putting 2 or 3 layers of paint. I mean, we can just look at this Pied Mondrian painting that we did a while ago. Let me see. Let's just bring this down here. And with this Mondrian, I think we probably put about 3 or 4 coats of red on here, right? And probably same thing with these blues and yellows, in order to get a deeper, more intense color. And whereas before the value might have been a little bit lighter, or potentially, well, usually it might have been lighter. By putting another color on it, usually we're deepening, darkening the value, right? So what that does, just before I move on, even though I'm going to come back to this, is it's going to increase the contrasts between especially these whites, right? And that's very specific to Mondrian, but that's one way that we can modify the value. Oops, sorry, jumping ahead here. So putting more paint on there, making that layer less transparent, making it more opaque, is going to modify the value. Usually it's going to darken it. Although if you put a second coat of white on it, again, like on this painting, by putting more and more white on this area, we're lightening it and lightening it and lightening it, right? You might say, putting white on top of white, how much more white can it get? Well, maybe we'll talk, I wasn't planning on it, but we could talk a little bit about the different kinds of white that exist, right? Because you can get whiter than white, just as you can get blacker. Well, it sounds ridiculous to say this, but you can get a really, really, really radiant white, and you can also get a really, really dark black. You may have even heard recently of Vanta black. It's so black that you can't see depth in it, right? Google it, Vanta black with a V, and it'll blow your mind. This is a very relatively recent advancement in terms of color technology. So lots of comments. I'm doing a lot of hand gestures. Yes. Let me see. So another way to modify the value of a color is to mix it with another color, right? So if you have yellow, and we just looked at yellow, it might be one of the lighter colors, not often, but generally is one of the lighter colors on our palette. If we mix it with blue, or add and make it a little bit more green, its value is going to get darker, right? It's going to deepen and darken that value. So that's obvious, but obviously the color is going to change, but its value will also change, right? And that's really important to know. Next here is we can apply a glaze, a semi-transparent glaze over top of the painting, or that area of that color that we're trying to modify. And that's something that is particularly common within classical painting. That's one of the primary ways that artists would modify the value of let's say a face. When Leonardo da Vinci is trying to get the smile of the Mona Lisa, and he wants to be just a little bit darker, shadows in there. He's putting very thin layers of glaze that are just adding a little bit more shadow, and that's modifying the value of the underlying color that was originally there, right? So that's something that we use a lot. That's why we use glazing fluid. It's a kind of essential part of the artist's toolbox. And then kind of the meat of what we're talking about today is mixing tints, tones, and shades. So tints, tones, and shades are probably the primary way that people can modify the value of a color. So we're going to spend most of the time today talking about tints, tones, and shades. And then just lastly, this is sort of technically not correct, but I just decided to put it in here anyway, is you can quote-unquote modify the value of a color by placing another color of different value next to it, right? So we see this all the time where, you know, you mix a color on the palette and then you paint it on the painting and you go, oh, that looked much darker or lighter on my palette. No, it's not quite as dark or as light as I hoped it would be, right? So it's because the colors that are surrounding it are influencing the way that we perceive that color. So for instance, if we were to then, let's say we had a yellow and we painted a color that on the palette doesn't seem to be that much darker, but all of a sudden you paint it and that yellow just so suddenly appears to almost have changed value. It seems to have lightened or darkened, right? So even though technically we're not actually doing anything to that paint, it's the way that it appears to our eyes can change because of the relationships of colors around it, right? So again, it's not technically really modifying the value, but it does change the way that we perceive it. So I thought I'd include that there. Okay, so the next thing I want to, so we're really gonna, again, we're gonna spend the majority of time talking about tints, tones, and shades. So tints, tones, and shades, what's important about them is that we can modify a color's value without altering its hue. And hue is in its simplest terms is kind of, you can use it interchangeably with color, but essentially what that means is down here I created a little bit of a for example to help clarify this idea. So for instance, we can take a red and we can make it lighter or darker by changing the tint, tone, and shade of that color without it changing into a different color, right? Without it moving around the color wheel. So for instance, let's just kind of go back up here. So if I modify the value using a tint, tone, and shade to this red, it's only going to get lighter or darker. It's not going to become an orange. It's not going to become a purple. It's not going to be pulled towards the browns. It's not going to all of a sudden change into a green, right? So that's one of the most important parts of tints, tones, and shades, right? And there are other ones on this list that also do not modify the hue and only affect the light and dark, but that's you know, I don't want to overcomplicate things here. So what are tints, tones, and shades? You're like, oh, that's great. So what on earth are we talking about, Michael? So tints here are when we add white to a color, right? So you might have heard of people saying, and again, sometimes often these words are used, often when it comes to painting, they're used incorrectly, but obviously they also have very different meanings outside of painting, right? So tint, when we add white to a color, right? So we have red and we add some white to it until maybe it's just pure white. Tones are where we add gray to a color, right? So if we keep on adding gray to a color and eventually there's no red left in it, then we've just got gray. And then shades are when we mix a color with black, right? So it gets darker and darker until it becomes pure black, right? Although one might say if we're mixing black into a color, there's still going to be a little bit of that color, so it won't be pure black. It'll still be, let's say in this case, red black, right? And unless we actually paint pure black right out of the tube right next to it, or white right out of the tube next to it, or gray right out of the tube if you want to use gray out of the tube, or you mix it yourself, right? So that's important. Burn this into your mind. Tints, tones, shades. Tint, white, tone, gray, black, shade, or so, one of the ways that the tint, I don't know why, I don't have a mnemonic device for remembering a tint, but when I think of tones, in order to help me remember that, I think of like a little witch going, "Oh, don't take that tone with me, little boy," right? This little kind of witch, right? So that's tones. Don't take that tone with me, right? And this witch has got gray hair right? So that's that's how we remember tones, grays, right? And shades, right? I think of like, don't throw shade at me, right? In that shade being black, right? You're throwing I'm thinking of like RuPaul's Drag Race of I'm not exactly anyway, shade just being the darkest thing you can throw at someone, right? I don't know if that helps at all. I might have just confused everybody even more. Okay, so before we start actually mixing the paint, and we're going to talk about this here, is why is it so important, right? Some of you are like, okay, I get it. So we're just going to add, black and gray and white to color. Great. Okay, that makes sense. It's super obvious, Michael. Is it, though? The reason why value is so important is that value contrasts will ultimately determine the success or failure of your painting. Most of us think of a painting as contrasts between different colors, right? Or when it comes to drawing and the compositional structure, or the lines and everything. Ultimately, it's how much contrast we have in our painting, which will determine how the viewer, what pulls them into the painting. Most beginners use very low value contrasts, right? So most of the time we have this situation where we have a painting that looks beautiful and super colorful and looks fantastic. And then if we were actually look at it in terms of black and white, we realize we're all kind of in the same middle mush of grays, right? We don't really have any major contrasts, and we want to amp up those contrasts. The great artists throughout history understood the importance of value, and if anything, like the great classic artists from the Renaissance forward, one of the only the main tool they had in terms of painting was value. They didn't have the pigments that we have today. They weren't able to make magenta like that's, or these bright blues, these super saturated greens and yellows. Most of their colors, if you look at the classic palettes that Rembrandt, Leonardo, etc. used, a lot of their colors were kind of quite close to the neutral core. So there are, a lot of these burnt umbers and raw siennas and, very earthy tones, right? So the only way they had to really create intense contrast was not through color, but through value. And where was there anything else? So just lastly here, before we get into the painting here, is that you want to think of value as like the invisible structure that underlies, that supports the entire painting. And without a strong understanding of how value really works, that painting is just sort of like a human without a skeleton. It's just a floppy thing, right? That if we add some serious value contrasts. It's like putting bones and muscle inside, right? And it's going to support the painting, right? So that's why it's super, super important. Okay. Let's start making some we're going to do this value scale right here, and we'll draw it with you here in a moment. So again, there's a template in the Dropbox. I'll show you where that is in a second. This is we can trace this out. I'm going to trace it out myself in a moment. And I'll just show, before we go too much further, that there's a number of different ways we can do this. We can do a very basic value scale just using 3 colors. Let's say a warm yellow, warm red, and a warm blue, right? Or you could do cool yellow, cool red, cool blue, right? And you'll end up with something that looks kind of like this, right? And so I think if you're a beginner artist, right, you're watching me for the very first time, you've just got your paints, this is probably what you should be thinking about doing. And we'll walk through this, but this would, for you to accomplish today, I think would be pretty satisfying and very important. On the other hand, however, this is what I aspire to do today, because I think this is stuff that I want to be able to pull out and show people when we're doing these exercises, so I can actually point very specifically to these different value contrasts. So I'm going to make 4 of these scales, and I'm going to do one that has a kind of a muted purple, a cool orange and warm green, because these are colors that are closest to the interior of the color wheel towards the neutral core. So this one, this would be the one, maybe I should have put that at the bottom, because it might be the one that, if you were only going to do 3, maybe you don't want to do that one on the top. But I'm also going to do a cool green, an orange, and a purple. So I'm going to organize them this way so that I can kind of lay them out, and it'll kind of create a nice little chart along the table. Anyway, that's my plan, and we'll see how far we can get. I assume I can do them relatively quickly. I've done this many times. So let's get right to it. Let's start making these different charts here, and I think it's going to be really helpful. The other thing, some people will be like, yeah, I kind of get it. I think I'm just going to watch this episode and I'll just absorb it all by osmosis, which is totally fine. But the other reason why I like to teach how to do a value scale is really it helps to mix colors with a great deal of sensitivity and because when we add black to a color, or white, and even gray, those colors are going to change those values so quickly that it's usually very, very surprising for people. Okay, so you're probably saying, okay, what on earth is he doing? What I'm going to do, this is my block that I use for sanding. And rather than just taking a piece of sandpaper to sand these panels, because I've gessoed them, is what I like to do is just take a block of just 2x4, just a little end, and I'm going to staple this together here. That way, I can get a nice even sanding on here. So I just thought I could have obviously done this beforehand, but I thought I would just show you could do this with any kind of staple gun. Okay, so, and at the moment of stapling, I will mute the microphone just so it's not too loud here. But I'm also going to put this on the side. That way I've got 2 nice flat sides to sand against, right? So pull these in tight, and I'm going to mute the microphone just so it doesn't blow out the speaker. Okay, so I could just use a hammer to tap those down. In fact, let me just get a hammer. Not sure where my actual hammer went, so I'm going to just mute this. Okay, so now I got this nice sanding block here. I'm just going to sand these really quickly. And that is also loud, so you know what? I'm going to mute the microphone for another second here and just sand these really quickly so it doesn't get too annoying. Okay. And, you know, I can imagine, you know, so probably a lot of you will just be painting on in your sketchbooks, and that's totally fine, or just paper that you might have. If you don't want to use a canvas for this, I can understand why some people would say this might be wasting a canvas, perhaps. But again, I'm gonna use canvas to do this, because I want to be able to have them nice and handy, and if they're on paper, they might get bumped and creased. So this just ensures that they'll have a little bit of a longer lifespan. Okay, so let's take a look at where you can get your outlines here. So obviously if you're watching, I encourage you to join the Facebook group. This Saturday, I can't remember at what time, I think it's at 2 or 3 o'clock, we're going to have another one of our feedback episodes where we're going to take a look at the artwork that anyone who would like to submit their artwork, uploading it to the Facebook, can get some free feedback from myself. Usually people find this some of the most helpful, useful part of these classes, including your color wheel, including your value scale, including these guys that we made last week, right? So, because I think it would be great just to see who's actually doing these, and especially if you've had any kind of difficulties or struggles along the way, this might be the perfect time to share it so that I can help you, right? That's the whole purpose, is to get better, right? And if you really want to get better, having somebody to kind of help you looking at the work that you've done might be a good idea. But of course, there's lots of other paintings that we've been doing over the past year and a half, and so I want to kind of catch up on some of those episodes. I think this one is, if I recall, I think it's mostly focused on Picasso, I think, because we did a whole week of Pablo Picasso work, so that's coming up on Saturday. Okay, so if we look in the Dropbox folder, because you want to get this value scale, you're going to click down. It's right near the very top of that folder. You're going to see that there is, of course, there's the color version here. These are warm colors. This is my warm yellow, warm red, and warm blue together. And you'll also see 2 versions of this. You'll see a PDF and a JPEG of this, whatever's easier for you to print off. Okay, so I'm gonna tape that down first, and then trace it out. My big plan today was to try to get this done before class started. I've pretty much going forward, most of these outlines will be done before we get started, but it was a little bit of a nice day, so my daughter and we went down to the beach, and with our rubber boots on, stopped in the ocean. My daughter loves the water. She loves stomping in puddles. So we went to the biggest puddle of all, the Pacific Ocean. And she was definitely having a great time, that's for sure. So I'm just going to use a ruler to do this. Now, if you don't have a printer and you can't download these templates, this is probably not the most difficult thing to draw, but I can understand if you feel it's a little bit more complicated. In that case, you may want to think about just doing one of these per page, like one for tints, one for tones, and one's for shades. Maybe I can show how I would divide that up here in a moment. So I'm going to do one of these, and I'll just get it started. And then I'll do the other ones later on. That way, it won't surprise me if, you know, I'm here for a little bit longer than usual, and people can tune out if they want, and then just come back at the very end. Because I know a lot of people do that anyway, and it doesn't hurt my feelings. I don't get upset about it. I can totally understand why that, you know, people aren't going to want to watch 4 hours of painting or 3 hours of painting or even 2 hours of painting. Which is why I have to give a great deal of thanks to one of our longtime viewers here, Lolly, who has been going through the old videos that we've done and writing down the timestamps for each one of them. Kind of just saying, okay, at the 3-minute mark, the video begins, etc. And that way other people following after her can just quickly and easily just jump to those parts of the video. So anyone else is welcome to do that as well. And so there we go. So that's what one of these will look like. So I'll just put this here and get that ready to go for the future. I'm not going to do it just yet, but it's me. Chloe G says, "Hey, love your work." Thank you, Chloe G. Okay, let's move these out of the way. I'm still here. Okay. So, as I said, if I was, I'm just trying to think about the best way to do this so I don't alienate somebody who's just beginning. I mean, I think what I'll do is maybe I'll start with these here, my cool blue, warm blue, and purple. But again, you could do this with any colors on your color palette. And I was also thinking about mixing my own grays and blacks today, because I tend to do a lot of that. But I think just for speed purposes, I'm going to just use the actual black and white from my tubes here. So to get started, we're going to use black and white. Maybe for many of you, if you want to do one of the blues, you could just start with this here. Right? Again, you could use your warm blue or cool blue. It's up to you. We're going to be using a lot of white and black today. The white is the most commonly used of all colors. Most paintings, specifically classic paintings, used a lot of white. Okay, so this is my cool blue. Okay, notice I'm not going to use, again, normally I would put my imprimatura over top of this. Do I want to do that today? Really quickly? I don't think I need to do that today. I think we've talked about it before. So let's, the way that I want to show you how I would go about doing this is, what I typically do is just paint the color in its pure form right out of the tube, right on the top rows, right? And let's see if I can zoom in on this here. On the handout, come on. You could see here 100% color, 0% white or gray or black, right? As we go down here, we have 95% color with just a little bit of white, gray, or black. Down here, about 50-50, and at the very bottom, we have, you know, mostly white, gray, or black with just a little bit of color. And I think it's really neat to, because maybe of all, this is maybe one of the most interesting rows here, where we're getting pretty close to that solid color, but just a little bit. That subtlety is really, really important, right? Because a lot of people are aware of just painting nice bright colors and maybe adding a little bit of white in there, but it's really the opposite side of things. When we've got a black that is, or a blue that is really, really, really dark, but it's not black, it's just a deep, deep blue. So we want to get those kinds of subtleties in here. Okay, so again, you can use whatever colors you like. I'm going to take my cool blue to start, and I'm just going to paint it right up here. And I'm not concerned about making these look super pretty and perfect. That's good enough for me. And there we go. So on this side, I'm going to take white and I'm going to mix it with this blue until I get to almost white. It'll just be a little bit blue. Over here, I'm going to mix gray into this blue until I'm almost at just a pure gray. And then here, I'm going to mix black into my color until I'm almost at pure black. Hopefully that makes sense to people. So just for convenience sake, so I don't smudge too much paint all over the place, I'm just going to start left to right here. And I think what I'm going to do is going to use another brush here. You could use a palette knife. Maybe I don't need quite that much paint. I'll put this right here. In fact, when it comes to the white, the easiest thing to do and the smartest thing to do is to actually start from the bottom and work my way up. Because if I try to lighten this color, I'm going to need like half a tube of paint to get that color lighter, right? So I'm just going to wash that brush. Okay, so let's take some white, mostly white. And this is where, again, that subtlety is important. Right, just a little bit of blue. And whoa, that's a lot of blue really quickly. Right, look how quickly that little bit of blue changed that color. So much so that I kind of moved away from it back into that white. Right, so I'm going to paint this right here. I'll maybe try to cover a little bit of my pencil lines or carbon paper lines just to get it a little bit lighter. All right, so if you're depending on the resolution of your screen, you may not even notice a difference here. You might say, "Oh, is there a color there?" That's great. We want that subtlety. So let's do this again. Let's take more blue. And let's paint this. Like that. Okay. Now I'm just gonna wipe this paint off my my brush, and now I'm going to kind of do the opposite. I'm just going to take this color and mix it into here, depending on how much paint you actually have in there. Right, so let's see if we can just zoom in here just to look at the differences between these. Because I think it's also, we're not just lightening up the color, especially when it comes to white. If we look at, this is our color right out of the tube. This is our cool color, our cerulean blue. Look how visible those paint strokes are in here, right? So we have this nice color, but there's also a lot of the white coming through and making those paint strokes look very apparent. Versus, look at this one here. This is when we add some white to it. When we tint the color, it's different. It's not hugely different, however. And now that kind of streakiness of the paint has gone away. And that's because titanium white, which is the white that probably 95% of people use in terms of art. Do I have my other whites? Don't want to go. I have lots of. Maybe just as it might be helpful. I always sort of wonder whether it's a good idea to talk about some of these things. So the reason there are other whites out there, which is confusing to people because people are like, "What? There's different whites? What does that mean?" So this is the white that we just used. This is our titanium white. This is 99% of, or I said 95. I don't know the measurements, but the majority of people, artists, are using titanium white. Titanium white is kind of like your HB pencil. It's kind of the best of both worlds, right? It's not too dark, it's not too light. It kind of smudges, doesn't smudge too much. So this is a great paint to use. On the other side of things, however, you can use here this brand anyway. Amsterdam makes what's called zinc white, right? And by other brands might use something called transparent mixing white, which is probably, I think this is a zinc composition in here. Does it say? Yeah. So it contains zinc, right? So I think I haven't actually used these two side by side. I was thinking about doing that for a future video, but essentially these two tubes of paint are identical. They just been named differently, right? Because the difference between titanium white and zinc white is zinc white has a lower tinting strength, right? It's about half the strength of the titanium white, which means to get it to be to do what we just did here, you need to use twice as much white. Again, I might just cap it at that in terms of, because that's a whole other like 20-30 minute long video to talk about that. But on the other side of things, we have how do they call this? Vivid white. Other brands might call it radiant white. And it's sort of on the other side of this. Like if we were to put, if we have a zinc white, which has a low tinting strength, and titanium white, which has a pretty high tinting strength, radiant white, or vivid white, as this brand calls it, is super, it tints a lot, right? So it's sort of like really, really white, right? It's kind of, it almost has like a brighter than white quality, right? Because the way that it interacts with light. I just think those are really, really fascinating. I don't want to talk about it too much more in terms of this video, because there's probably a few people whose eyes are already glazing over a little bit, but I just sort of a quick introduction that there's sort of infinite possibilities down that road here. Okay, so let's clean this brush. Okay, so let's move on to, actually I was going to paint a little bit of white in here. And you can also just sort of paint a little bit over those lines, and you can see how it by the fact that it tints so well, it's very opaque, right? It's going to hide most of those pencil lines, right? Especially if I did another coat of this white, it would disappear. So now when we talk about mixing a gray, I think I'm going to mix a kind of a large amount of gray so that I can continue to use it over and over again. It's similar to what we did here. We don't need to add a lot of black to this gray, or to this white to turn it into a gray. In fact, there's a little bit of black here. Let's put that in there. And there's all sorts of different kinds of gray, right? We can make a dark gray, a light gray. It's kind of up to you, but kind of want something right around in the middle. And you could buy tubes of gray. I think I've got a tube of gray. This claims to be neutral gray. I'm not going to use it, but we can see it's, you know, pretty close. You know, to get it to this so-called neutral gray, I could mix a little bit more black in here. In fact, let's just do that, in case somebody actually is using that gray. Okay. And then I'm just going to put this down here on the bottom. Okay. And let's sort of replicate what we did before. I'll just put some gray down here. And Susan says, I'd love to see a future video on those whites. Yeah. There's lots of little things like that I want to do. So certainly if you've got ideas like that, let me know and I'll try to incorporate them. So let's do the same thing. We're going to take this gray and I'm going to add just a little bit of blue to it. Just a little bit. I actually usually do the black and white and then gray at the after I've done the black and the white as a little bit of a just because I think it is kind of interesting because it's kind of the forgotten one. Gray, a lot of people don't think about mixing gray into the painting. They always think either putting white or black into a painting to get lighter or darker, but they don't really think about the gray in between. So let's continue here. Let's take a little bit more of this blue. And I think that's really beautiful. Like What a cool color that is. Right, and if you hadn't mixed these colors before, you might not even think of that as being an option. Okay. So this is mostly cool blue with just a little bit of gray on the brush. And once again, we see a similar sort of effect that we saw previously here, right, with our tints, in that it's also, we've lost that, the texture that we saw originally. And, you know, it's actually sort of lightening up as we go here, right, because it's this blue is one of the darker colors, not the darkest, but it's certainly darker. So we're actually, in terms of the value, it's lightening up as we go closer down here, which is kind of the opposite of this. Okay. So there's a lot of questions in the chat here. So let me see. I'm just going to scroll back up here, see if I can. Kevin says, hi, worldwide, cool family, or family, cool artwork is so cool, I can't be all over the place and stay and listen. Okay, so much going on. Okay, family, churches, worldwide, peace. Pascal says, gold has more value than silver. For a second, I thought we were talking about color theory, and I was like, oh, I've never thought about it. And then I'm like, oh, dad joke. Here I am. I'm the master of the dad joke, and it took me a while. Okay. Pascal says, Tanya, I'm doing the same, having fun with chiaroscuro and sfumato. Oh, in terms of the pronunciation of those words. Pascal says, Vanta Black looks nuts. 1.5% reflectance. Apparently, Anish Kapoor secured exclusive artistic rights to the material from the manufacturer, so we probably can't find it. That's a whole other thing. We talked about that when we did an Anish Kapoor painting. The, I think, is this it right here? I think this is this the Anish Kapoor? Yeah, right. So this is the Anish Kapoor, this super textured thing that we made. Right, so that's the guy that, yeah, that's a whole other story. We talked about that in that whole episode. Sandra says, I feel like I never think of mixing tone. I always either do tint or shade. Hopefully we'll talk about the importance of tone today so I can learn the value of tone, pun intended, right? So that's what we're sort of just getting at here. Pascal says, if you play with tint and then add black, or play with shade then add white, it's as if you played with tone. So there is a difference between painting something, let's say, and you could do this yourself. So I think if what I understand you're saying, Pascal, is that, you know, you paint something, let's say you do this black, you add black to what we're about to do, and then you add a little bit of white to try to simulate gray. It's a difference, like adding a glaze. A glaze is different than actually mixing the paint. It's like the difference between making a hamburger and sticking all the ingredients on top of one another versus putting all those ingredients into a blender and then slurping it through a straw, which, you know, probably is not very desirable, but it's also going to taste a little bit different, right? As any sort of chef would probably tell you that, or, you know, it's like James Bond, shaken not stirred, right? That the stirring, the blending of it is actually going to change the way that flavor tastes. It's the same sort of thing with paint. Even though technically those colors are all there, by glazing is a different process than physically mixing the paints together. All really interesting conversations today. This is great. it's different, although it's probably going to be very closely the same. So let's move now to our black here. So now this is where the color changes immediately. So in this case, when we do black, I am just going to go down this way because of how intense black is. So let's just take a little bit of black. Like, I mean, that's a tiny bit of black, but we put that in here and all of a sudden that paint is much different, right? We can also see that when we added black to this color, we actually still see the brush strokes in there, because black, while it's dark, it doesn't have the same opacity qualities as white does. So let's go in here again. Let's take more black. Let's add a little bit more blue. And I know when I do these exercises in person with people, a lot of people, you know, get upset because they feel like they've mixed it too dark or too light. Because let's say you do this and then you're like, oh, I think this one should be down here. I made a big... Don't worry about it, right? If you're really, really upset with having done it incorrectly, just let it sit, let it dry, use a blow dryer, paint some white over it, and mix it again. Right, so now we're just going to take a lot more black, mostly black. We'll put a little bit of blue back in here. And this is just going to, for all intents and purposes, just appear to be black. I mean, even myself, I'm thinking maybe I could have, you know, lightened it up a little bit, you know, gone a little bit closer to here. Okay, and here, I'm just going to take black right out of the tube. And here, so technically there should be a slight difference between these colors, but especially because the blue is already pretty dark anyway, you know, that the difference is going to be negligible. Deborah says, hello folks, I just had family over, so I'm late. I had a great time with these kids. I did these charts already, but Rick has not, so we're having a date night with Michael and you folks. Cool. Ravi says, I am in for next week for Vasily Kandinsky. I can't make portraits. I skipped those. I like abstract and landscapes. I am gessoing tonight. Cool. And Sandra says, Michael, what kinds of differences would you see in paintings in which we use our own gray from the local color and a gray straight from a tube like that? Or in shadows on a painting, when would we choose to use a tone or a shade? Okay. Okay. So, you know, it's almost a discussion for that I should prepare a video for, to kind of really suss out all of the. In fact, I was thinking about doing this for today, but I didn't want to overcomplicate it. So, do I want to outline? I can kind of just off the top of my head talk about some of the differences between, like, when you want to use white, gray, and black. So let me get started on the next color, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. Okay, so what did I decide I wanted to do next here? So again, if you are painting this and you're just beginning, I would move to maybe a red and then a yellow, and you could use whichever color you choose. Maybe it's you would do all cool colors side by side, or maybe you do all warm colors side by side. In this instance, however, I'm going to now paint a warm blue right in the center, followed by a purple right next to it. So I'm going to have those three colors in here in terms of this specific painting. Okay, so my warm blue, and I might speed up a little bit as I do these, just so that I can try to get as much of this done as possible. It would be great to have 3 of these, or 4 of these by the end. Okay, so I'm going to take my warm blue, and again, I have wanted to do a color chart like this, like a value scale, for probably 10 years like this, to do all of the major colors. And I'm hoping that I'm going to learn something from this process. Right? That, I mean, it's, again, all of the, like, when it comes to value, it's one of those things where you're like, it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? What these colors are going to do. And then it's sort of like, once you actually do it, there's usually kind of a revelation. You're like, whoa, I did not expect that result to actually happen here. So I might just go down, since I've got this blue on my brush right now, I think I'm just going to take a little bit of black and just mix it here. So I'm just taking a little bit of black. Again, just look at the difference here. It almost takes this color and gives it a slightly cooler quality. That black, you know, that would confuse me if I was trying to kind of pick those colors out, because that little bit of black in there, it definitely, I mean, it's still warmer, but it does feel like it's moved slightly towards the colder spectrum, which is, that's right there is a bit of a surprise to me. Right, so that's good. It's nice to be surprised. Let's put a bit more blue in here. That black is just so dominant. Right, so it's just too much. I'm still going to come back and add more blue to it. And then let's come back to this dark, dark, dark blue. Right, so they look almost identical. This definitely, you know, is appears to be darker. Well, I almost feel like I want to remix that one just to. Okay. So. Terry is not awesome says, I can't stay on this live, but I just want to say that I'm starting your drawing course, and it's probably the best course that I ever took, and it's free. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you, Terry. That's really cool. Yes, sorry, this is my warm blue is my ultramarine blue. Thanks, Pascal, for pointing that out. Okay, I think this is mostly dry in here, so I'm just going to paint kind of right there. Let's take our white and a little bit of blue. Right, I'm going to go right over here to my tints. And you know, if there, it's not like it doesn't have to be perfect science here, right? We want to have a little bit of fun while we're doing it, so I wouldn't be too hard on myself, like, because it's pretty subjective as to where each of these, like we could literally mix hundreds of thousands of different colors, different values just in between these two, right? So where you land on that is you know, it's certainly open to a lot of interpretation there. Again, all those brush strokes have just disappeared, and now we have kind of a very nice gradation of colors. So let's do the tones. Let's clean this brush off. Sandra says, I'm sorry for the loaded question, Michael. I'm glad to at least get the question out there, as it's been something I've been thinking about. Oh, I'd certainly... it is a great question. I'm just, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I don't know if my brain is big enough to multitask big questions like that all at one time. So let's take this gray, and let's take a little bit of blue. Just a bit more. So essentially, kind of like by just adding a little bit of a color to our gray, what we're doing is sort of modifying, in a way you're modifying the gray, right? Right here we've got a cool gray, and right here we've got a warm gray, and you know, maybe depending on your screen there might not be that much of a difference, but those two colors could create very different effects in a painting, right? There might, you know, depending on where that, let's say you're painting clouds or reflections, it could be really important to either have a warm or a cool color. And we can see just by adding a blue, a cold blue or a warm blue, we can get a different kind of color temperature for our grays. So we don't have to just use yellow or reds. We can mix in a little bit of blue just to modify that color slightly. So let's add more blue in here into this gray. It's interesting, it almost seems to be absorbing the color in there. That's kind of fascinating to me. Like color is very strange. Like what it does is there's a little bit of a you could see why artists have been obsessed with color for centuries. And if you've ever taken an art class with, like, I remember being in art school and being in these classrooms and people just start talking about, like, oh, I'm really into magenta this week, and you're just like, you're into what on earth does that mean? You're into a color this week? Like, that's crazy. And then you get into it and you're like, ah, yeah, I'm into it. I'm into that color. I don't know. Just making that a little bit deeper. Okay. Personally, I find this really helpful, actually doing these side by side and seeing how these different blues are behaving. I mean, I've always suspected this would be a really useful kind of thing, but never been in a situation where I would indulge myself to this extent. So this is, you know, in terms of just pure selfishness, I'm really happy to be doing this. Okay, so now I'm going to take some magenta and I'm going to make a purple that I'm going to mix with all of these here. So to make this purple, I'm taking my cool red and my warm blue, and I'm going to make a purple. And of course, there's all sorts of purples that we could make, right? We go to our color wheel. Which purple I mean, that already is just like, I don't know. Do we want to make a little bit more of a cool magenta purple? Do we want to have a bit more of a blue purple? You want to go right in the middle? I mean, that's, I mean, I honestly, probably going a little bit in between is probably the most prudent thing. But okay. So now I got this nice purple here. So some people tuning in late might be like, whoa, this is a different exercise than he's done before. Right, so I have recommended that people just do a red, yellow, and blue, maybe all warm colors or all cool colors. I am just doing I'm going to do 4 of these in a short period of time because I've always been curious to see how these work together. So now that I got my purple in there, let's do the same thing with the black. So I'm going to go to the black first. Oh, put way too much black in there. Ugh. That drives me crazy because once it gets kind of, I think I'm going to paint this down here. And then I'm just going to go full black. Or not full black, just mostly black with a little bit of purple in here. Ooh, that is a nice color, that deep purpley black. It probably doesn't show up on camera very well, but there's a quality to that like, this is exactly why I think for me this is good to do this. Even though I've been painting for 25 years, that's the awesome thing about painting, is like when the paint just sort of tells you something new. Okay, so let's take this purple again and add just a little bit of black. What I find with black is it, in very small quantities, it almost looks like the color's gotten a little bit dirty, right? It sort of looks like you're painting with watercolor, and the water in that you're using to dip your paintbrush into your watercolor is just you've been painting for all day long, and you're like, I gotta change my water. That's sort of what a color looks like when you add just a small amount of black. And I can imagine some people being like, why on earth would I ever want that? Why would I want a color that sort of looks like it's a bit dirty? That's craziness. Well, there's all sorts of reasons why you might want that particular color. If you're trying to get that effect, knowing how to get it is really important, right? So, if you wanted to just barely modify it, right? A lot of the times people will mix other colors in. The great thing with using tints, tones, and shades is we preserve the original color. The color's not changing hue. It's not becoming more red or more blue or anything else. It's just getting darker here. I know it sounds just like super obvious, but how it gets darker, what that actually looks like looking at this, now that I see that, that is a purple that I would want to use more often in my backgrounds. I could see myself making we've made our own black before using warm red, cool blue, and cool yellow. Adding just a little bit of magenta, like a little bit of cool red, and to make that a bit more of a, or just making a purple and then just mixing a little bit of that purple into the dark, I think could just give that some, like a foreground. Okay, so, maybe, okay, I will just, actually, you know what, let me finish this, and then how about we'll talk about, I'll do a quick summary as to when you would want to use these colors, okay? So that way I can finish one of these, and then we can talk. That makes sense, okay. Just have to, get my bearings as to how I want to do these things. Where am I going to do this? This palette's quickly filling up. Okay, let's do this right here. So take my white, just a little bit of purple. It's almost a little bit too much purple in my white. I probably would have liked it to have been a little bit more subtle. But it is what it is. I can always do that again. Let's just take a bit more purple. I need just a bit more white again. Okay. And then let's do this with mostly purple here. I'm not even going to mix it into the white. I'm going to let the white that's on my brush do the work. Cool. Doesn't these look great? I just love these. Okay, let's do the tones now. So I'm not going to really bother washing my brush because I'm just going to dip right into... How are we doing this? We go from our gray. mix the gray right in here. Oops. Okay, let's get more. Okay, and now I just need to mix just a little bit more gray. Just ran out right at the end. So we'll mix this here. With our gray. Okay. So let's now we'll take a look at all three of these side by side. Susan says, "I'm loving the purple shades." Yes, they're so nice, isn't it? Just purple, such a beautiful color, very unused color in the artist's palette. And you know what? I'm just going to wipe a bit of this away and let this dry a bit while we're painting the next few things. It will probably have some impact on... Oh. We'll see. See how much we can get away with. Worst throw ever. Susan says, "I'll be spending tomorrow doing this. It makes such a difference to see the color side by side." Right? It does. That's exactly what I was hoping, is that when we actually do all of this, that it can be kind of revelatory for people. Okay, so let's just take a moment to kind of dissect and think about what we have in front of us and why this is so important. Okay, so let's start with our tints. So if we think about value and why value is so important, we want to be able to have high contrasts, right? And generally we want to have our darkest colors closer to us and the lighter colors further away. Or lighter values, I mean, so that you think about it like if you're standing looking at a landscape and you're looking at mountains or buildings far away, you'll notice that because of atmosphere, the particles of air and oxygen, dust, and other things in the air, that things that are further away tend to kind of get a little bit softer, right? Maybe they lose some detail, and maybe they also lose some saturation. They will lose saturation of color, right? So because there's literally, it's not just empty space in between things, there's air. I'm breathing it right now, right? So that means that things further away, like mountains and buildings or whatever else, are going to appear to be slightly lighter. So we might be using either tints or tones, depending on the weather and the quality of light, on things that are furthest away from us, right? Now, sometimes we have a very dark background, and so we can obviously use dark colors, but as I've always say, when we use black, we want to be very careful, because black tends to be the color that comes closest to us. It just leaps forward. So if you put black outlines on something, it's going to want to come right forward. It sits on the surface of the paper. Or if you think of a painting like a window, if you put black right in your painting, it's like a bug that went right up to the window, right? So you want to use your shades relatively sparingly, really only for foreground elements. And if you do use a dark color for a background, you may even want to think of having a bit more of a tone in there, just to soften it up so that you have a little bit of a separation between the two. And, just thinking, like, that's how we do things in paintings. Like, there's photography, sometimes we might have very strong dark shadows further in the background, but that's often how cameras process things, and things might look great in a camera, but in painting we want to use the values to our benefit. So if I was let's say I had I think I've got something I could share to kind of point this out, but maybe that's again for another episode. So again, if I was painting mountains that are farther away, I'd be thinking about using tints, right? So if this was, or sky, clouds, tints and tones would be for stuff like that. Things that are further away. You can use these for highlights, right? If there's, if somebody's wearing a blue helmet and they're in the foreground, we probably are going to have some light reflecting off of it, but the majority I would reserve is for the background. I hope that that's just off the top of my head. If I think about it some more, I'm sure I can think of more a nuanced explanation for things. Okay, so I'm gonna move that to the side, and I'm gonna start another one here. In fact, I might just crank out a bunch of outlines really quickly here. And so this might be the time in the episode actually where I might say to people, if I was just doing this episode on its own, and we had done one of these just like we just finished here with the cool blue, warm blue, and the purple, that would probably be enough for most people, right? I would probably suggest you do something more like this than what I just did, just so you could see a little bit more variety. But once you've accomplished that, then our final step would be to say, go and paint. Now you understand, even maybe not completely, because there's always more to understand with painting. Every time, like even just putting together this, I start thinking, man, there is some complexity to these things that even I'm not, like, I'd really have to think about it because it's pretty mystifying. But once you've got these things, then what I would do is go off and start painting. Starting on Tuesday of next week, we are going to be we're going to be doing a kind of a very simple painting on Tuesday, and on Thursdays we're doing a little bit more complex painting. So if you want to join us next week, next Tuesday, we're going to be, in fact, maybe let me see if I can pull this up here. Just to give people a quick idea of what's coming down the pipeline here. Just give me 1 second here. Alright, okay, here we go. So I'll just share a little bit of the behind the scenes here, all my planning for what we're doing here. So here's classes we've already done coming up over the next little while here. So on Thursday, in just a couple of days, we're going to be painting a very famous grisaille painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci needs really very little introduction, But one of the uses for understanding value, especially in classic painting, is a lot of artists would paint an entire painting in grays, right? Using tints, tones, and shades to make an entire almost finished painting, and only then would put color over top of it in thin glazes. A lot of the paintings that we're most familiar with were done using those techniques. It's definitely a very uncommon technique these days. Very few people actually use that technique today, but that was really the primary way most artists executed a lot of the most famous paintings in history. And so next Tuesday we're painting a very simple Vasily Kandinsky painting, and then next Thursday we're going to paint a much more complex Vasily Kandinsky painting. Kandinsky is, arguably one of the most important artists of the last century, especially at the beginning of the century. One of the persons that really kicked off the modern, arguably the first abstract painter, the person that might have changed the trajectory of art more so than any other artist. So that's going to be really fascinating. The week afterwards, we're going to be looking at Sonia Delaunay, and we have done when we did the intro to painting course, we did do a different Sonia Delaunay painting, the flamenco dancer. So we're going to do something a little bit simpler, but maybe from the same kind of period of time, but without a figure. So that's going to allow us just to play with some color. And then on Thursday, we're going to be looking at one of her portraits that she did. I love those portraits. And then the week after, we're going to do like a whole week on Henri Matisse, the famous French painter, the great rival to Picasso. So I'm super excited to do some of the cutouts. We're going to learn how to glue collage paper onto canvas, so we'll talk all about that. We'll be painting on paper and then cutting that paper out, gluing it onto canvas. Of course, you're certainly welcome just to use the templates to paint directly without using paper, but if you want to learn how to do some collage, that'd be helpful. And we'll just go a little bit further down here. We'll see we're going to be looking at Paul Klee, a very famous painter who did like very exuberantly simple paintings, right? As well as we're going to continue on the most expensive paintings of all time. And so I think number 38 on that list is this Paul Cézanne painting. To celebrate the birthday of Michelangelo, we're going to be painting the famous creation of Adam, the two fingers touching. Franz Marc, we're going to do Van Gogh, David Sugarly, Monet's Haystacks, Nicole Eisenman, who is probably the greatest painter really alive today. I'd say that she might be of kind of like my generation, or kind of a little bit older than me. I think she was, I would argue, probably the best painter alive. So we'll talk about her in March. Marc Chagall, and then Warhol, and then more and more stuff coming down the pipeline. So lots of stuff. So I just want to kind of share a little bit of insights as to where we're going. So Tuesdays are the easier paintings, Thursdays more complex. Okay, so Heather said, what is the name of the warm blue? And as Sandra answered, yes, it is the ultramarine blue. And where did I put my ruler? There it is. So if you want to continue painting along with me, I'm just going to do I'm going to do 4 of these color charts here. Oops. And I'm using a different colored pencil to draw these lines so that I can actually see which lines I've done and which ones I haven't done. Otherwise, it can get pretty confusing. And it's probably going to get confusing as I get so many colors on here. I won't be able to tell the difference. I just have to use my lizard brain to try to remember. And you could see, you could do this type of a process without actually even a color. You could just use your fingernail to scratch through. You could use like a spoon, whatever it is that you could put pressure on that will create pressure on the carbon paper. So I'll just... Okay. Alright, so here's one. I'm just going to prep a bunch of these simultaneously, so that way I don't have to do this again. I always like having a bit of an assembly line when I'm working. That way I kind of keep in the same mental space, painting. Like, I find it sometimes a little bit difficult to jump out of one mode of thinking to another. So let's keep on going here. So if at some point I look up and there's only one person watching, it won't offend me. That's happened many times before, so I kind of expect it to happen. If you've got other questions, however, about painting while I'm doing all of this, feel free to ask away, and I'll do my best in my semi-distracted state to answer those questions, as I generally do anyway. Sandra's question about when to use shades and tones and even tints, although she didn't ask that, I don't think, I can't remember, is a great question, and I think it just demands maybe a little bit more attention from me because I know that there's other reasons that maybe just escape me at the moment. And that's one of the funny things about I guess, like, teaching anything, is sometimes, like, we do things, or I do things, and I just do it so intuitively that I can't really remember why I do it. So having, these episodes really force me to kind of sit down and do a little bit of planning and think through my ideas. And so it's actually really helpful for me. In many ways, like, being a teacher just gives me permission to spend time researching and thinking and exploring things that I'm already interested in, and I just want to know the answers myself. Pascal asks an interesting question there. Okay. Adding white makes a color lighter. Is there a way to make it brighter? It's not the same as lighter. Is brighter a different hue, or maybe hue is the wrong word? Okay. Okay, so, I think what you're talking about, Pascal, is saturation, I think, right? So, we can lighten a color by adding white to it, right? In terms of lightening the value, it becomes lighter. But often when we lighten a color, it becomes more pastel-y, right? And that's not necessarily desirable. Sometimes we don't want it to kind of, like, for instance, we add white to red, it starts to become kind of pinkish, right? And that may not be a desirable color that you might want. You might just want it to be more saturated, more red, right? And so other artists will, so saturation or chroma is the level of intensity of that color, the amount of like pigment or mass tone. And you can't, if you use like the reddest red and you apply it to the canvas, you can't make it any more red than it is. In that case, you would probably want to modify the colors around that color to make it appear as if that red has become more saturated. And so that kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, is that sometimes we can change the value of a color, or appear to change the value of a color, simply by modifying the values or hues of colors that surround it, which is pretty fascinating, to be quite honest. Like, that's, you've probably seen, like, at if you've gone to like a science center, you know, there might be a box saying like, this is gray and this is the exact same gray, but they look, one looks much darker than the other because there might be a checker pattern around it that gives us the illusion that it's much, those two values are much different. Okay, just gonna clean up my studio for a second here before I launch into a lot more painting. So I think, you know, to kind of go back to what you're saying, Pascal, like, the only way to get a more intense red than this is to actually go and get another red from the art supply store that might be even more saturated than this. And that is, you know, if you're like, this paint brand here is sort of your intermediate student brand of paint as they market it, right? They do make, this is what is the Royal Talons is the parent company, and Royal Talons makes some very high-end expensive paint, and that expensive paint just has a more it's more expensive because there's more pigment, and so that you're going to get a more saturated color from it. Great questions, my goodness. So what was it that I was going to paint next here? So what have I painted? I've painted this bottom one here. Let's go to the cool, or since I've got a lot of that cool blue left, maybe I'm gonna skip up here and do this cool green, because I'm just looking at my palette and I've got this some of that blue in here, rather than just toss it in the garbage, because I'll use it, I'll need some of that anyway. Let's go here. So I'm gonna make a cool green, cool yellow, and warm yellow. Okay. So let's get our I'm gonna make a batch of it. Okay, and so it always, again, there's a question of like, which green do I want to actually make here? Do I want to make a green that's closer to here, or, you know, I'm probably going to err for something, you know, in this area, a little bit more of a yellow green probably. So in the same way, to mix this, I'm going to take maybe a little bit less. It's not going to be 50-50 yellow to blue. It's going to be maybe more like 30% blue, 70% yellow. Get this nice, beautiful color. Love it. And just because I used to be a carpenter, so it's always measure twice, cut once, right? So I'm just, okay, I'm going to put my cool green right there. Then cool yellow, warm yellow. Okay, so cool green is going to go here. And I'm also just thinking, you know what, I'm probably going to be very surprised at some moment and go like, oh, oops, I should have painted this. Whatever. It's the effort that counts, right? Okay, so now let's take, I'm going to start with my blacks. So I got to, let me see, let's take a bit of this color off here. In fact, let's put a bit of this down. Take a little bit of black. Whoa, that color just changed pretty radically, didn't it? Right, so that's interesting how that cool green sort of becomes a bit warmer when I put that black in there. I would not have, I guess now that I see it, it's like, oh yeah, of course that's what would happen, but it you know, it has a bit more of that grassy color that we would expect, you know, here. It's sort of, you know, it's being pulled towards the neutral core, not surprising. But I would not have expected it, like that's, it almost looks like there's a bit of warm yellow that I've mixed in here. That's interesting, right? Those are very cool things to realize. So let's take a bit more black. That's actually quite a lot. Okay. And then let's just go lots of black. Still want to get some green in there. I don't want it to just be pure black, but and you know, with a color like this greenish black, it's often, we can't even really tell that there's green in it at all until we get another color next to it. And that's kind of what's neat about doing this is, for all intents and purposes, that just looks like black. But when we put the other color, you're like, oh, actually that's clearly a greenish black. And that's what I mean when we put other colors side by side to these colors, it changes the way that we perceive that color. Pascal says saturation. That's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering. So we may be limited when we pick our base colors. Yes, right? So that's why I pick these for our classes. You know, picked this fairly bright, saturated color palette, right? Because that way we start out with very saturated colors, and then we can lower the saturation, the intensity of those colors, but you can't get more saturated. There's no way to make this an even brighter red than the red we have here, but unless you actually go and use an actual different color. So these colors are all very saturated. We can desaturate them, but we can't make them even more saturated. I mean, by painting multiple layers of color on top of one another, like I said with that, you know, the Mondrian, right? We can build up the intensity of that color with 3-4 layers of, and it's going to become a much more, you know, it's almost like having a more expensive paint. Okay, so let's go to, let's tint this now. So let's take this color. Oh, I was going to put white in there first, wasn't I? Let's wipe that off. Let's take some white. Let's do this right down here. I'm going to paint this in here. Okay. Put a little bit too much white in there. Maybe I put a little bit too much color in there. It's hard to say. Let's paint here. Okay. So again, you know, the differences between these are maybe less intense. Like we have the white in here. It does kind of just give it a little bit of a pastel, but it's not changing the opacity nearly as much as when we did with the blue, right? Well, that's kind of interesting to me. It goes to show that how that yellow actually has got a bit of a tint, as a not tint, opacity that is surprising. The combination, that green that it makes, it already has a level of opacity to it that the blue lacks on its own. Okay, let's take our gray here. Let's take a bit of the green. Oops. Like, it's interesting. I look at this, and that clearly looks like a green-gray. I paint it on here, and without any other color around it, it just sort of looks like a gray. It doesn't really look, you know, but any different in any real way. It's sort of just like, oh, okay, that's just gray, isn't it? So that's why it's so fascinating, this stuff. Okay, I think what's interesting too is, you know, if we just look at the tints and the tones together here, how they're usually pretty similar in this area. Again, it's just, but they're slightly darker, almost maybe a little bit. It feels like it almost goes a little bit further backwards spatially, like it recedes somehow. I don't know how to explain it. That's interesting though, to see those side by side in terms of green. Wow, a lot of comments just rolled in here. Sanders says, Pascal, doing the purple made me think to test and see what kinds of different purples I would get by mixing different cool reds and warm blues. Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, we did do a little bit of that. I mean, here if we take this is our magenta, and we mix it, so that's our cool red and our warm blue, and we mix them together. These are just 3 different types of purples that we could make from those 2 colors. Obviously, we could make tens of thousands of little tiny variations in between these here, but you could certainly find, some people might prefer a little bit more of a cooler purple, a little bit more of a magenta, and some people want a bit more of a bluey purple, right? I know, like, so for instance, the Los Angeles Rams football team, like they have a purple, it's a blue, it's like an ultramarine blue. It's got a tiny bit of in fact, the new uniforms are almost entirely blue, right? But traditionally they had a little bit more of a purpley quality to them. And same sort of thing like the Los Angeles Kings hockey team. Originally, just like the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team, had a purple that was more in this area, but over the years it's gotten more and more blue, right? And sports teams do that all the time, where they modify their base colors and just sort of shift them a little bit here and there over the years, because they think one looks a little bit cooler and hipper, which I think is very funny to think of, like a color becoming cooler, or like not in terms of color temperature, but just more hip. Okay. So what was I going to do next? I'm going to do my cool yellow and then warm yellow. So we'll put cool yellow in here. Yeah, if your purple is kind of got a maroony color, that just sounds like it's got a little bit too much of magenta in it, right? Or maybe even a little bit more of a warmer color in there. If it's not getting as vibrant, maybe we need to have an even cooler red. Pascal says, yeah, I'm preparing a 10 by 30 inch canvas to do all the color experiments in one. There's so many dimensions to it, not sure how to represent it. Let me see. Since you're talking about this, Pascal, here's a book on that I was looking at, potentially thinking of doing some of these here, but I decided this might be a little bit too crazy. But you could do a chart like that if you're thinking about making a gigantic painting. You could do this kind of color as value chart, and you could kind of see these different colors and how you mix them when you add a little bit of different values in here. Let me see if there's, you could do these types of things, like going from I think this would be another great exercise for us to do, is to go from like red, and then you're mixing it with its opposite, its complementary color. So you're taking red and then you're mixing it with green, just sort of like what we're doing here. But as you go from one to the other, we're going kind of through the neutral core, so we're getting kind of these muddy browns inside here. Same thing, going from orange to blue, yellow to purple. Let's see if there's another idea. And this goes along the lines of sort of some of the things we're talking about, how the exact same color surrounded by other colors appears to change that color. Again, if you're interested in this book, How to Paint Living Portraits by Roberta Carter Clark. I just got this from the Vancouver Public Library. That's really the only part of it that I really spend any time looking at, but it does have some ideas on, you know, sketching and drawing and all that kind of stuff if you're getting really into it. Okay. So let's take our cool yellow, and I'm going to paint that. Okay. Now let's take a little bit of, notice how, like, I've had to mix all the colors except this black, like, or, I mean, I barely need any of it to get by. And whoa, that was like less than 1 grain of black, and it just changed this color pretty radically. Like, I mean, can you imagine, like, how intensely it became this very mustardy color so quickly, and I was barely any black on there. It's almost like too dark, much darker than I would probably want it to be, but that's how quickly it changes this yellow. Yeah, definitely a little difference there. Okay. Let's go to our tints, I think, now. And take some white. Let's put this white down here. A little bit of yellow. It was a little bit more than I was hoping again. That's okay. You know, I see people talking about how they love those charts, like from that book. It's in, like, for instance, Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky that we're going to be looking at over the next month here in February are two artists that I think many people wandering through a museum, I'd say, this person is obviously, it's just children's art here. Anybody could do that. And what's interesting is those two artists are among the most serious artists in from the 20th century when it comes to, like, color theory. Both of them wrote a lot and did a lot of research and deep thinking about color, and the art that they ended up creating was very kind of simple and playful. And I just think that's kind of interesting. Like, we would imagine that if you were really deeply into color theory, that the kind of art you would make would be also very, you know, it would just sort of reek of intellectualism. And I just think it's funny that the two artists that really probably did the most, like, deep thinking about it ended up creating works that might be most easily dismissed by the vast majority of the public. I don't know what that's about. It's sort of like, maybe in terms of music, like a musician like John Cage, the famous kind of avant-garde musician who did the famous piece where it's what's it called, 422, where there's really no actual playing of the piano. It's the pianist comes and sits down at the piano bench, opens it up, and then there's just sort of silence and just listening to the audience. And It's the kind of thing that obviously many people ridicule and think is just absurd. But I need a little bit lighter than that. But he himself was also like very super serious in terms of like his thoughts on music, and I don't know what that's about. I think maybe it's when you're that like emotionally, intellectually invested in something like that, you always want to try and think of like, what is the clearest, most simple expression of these complicated concepts? I think anyway. That's okay. So let's take this gray, a little bit of yellow. Look at that color. Kind of strange. It's like the color starts to almost look a little bit green. Right? Like if I was going to try to mix that color, that would be a stumper for sure. I'd be like, my goodness, what on earth am I looking at? How do I make that? Okay. And then lastly, just take a little bit of that gray. Right, and then we paint that, and we can see side by side, it's got a little bit of that muddiness that we see with our when we add the black to the yellow. But it still has a bit of the softness that we see with the tint, right, when we add the white to it. And again, those kind of things sound familiar or obvious, but for me, I always, it's, I don't know, it's pretty amazing to me. Susan says, can you recommend a beginner book for color theory? You know, to be honest, one of the reasons why I'm doing these classes is because I can't think of like a really, really good book. I've had to like cull everything I know from like dozens of different sources, and one of the reasons why I've been teaching these classes is out of a deep frustration with how difficult it is for, like, I just think to myself, man, if I was trying, like, how did I learn what I know? Like, I wish there was just a book that would just tell you everything. And so that's sort of like what I've been devoting the past couple of years towards, is trying to kind of simplify everything for anybody who wants to know. So, you know, if you're watching this video a few years from now, there should be a little link in the description below to the book, and all of these things that we've been painting will be in there. Because there's a lot of different little books, but there's some things that I agree with more than others from different authors, and it's so it's really hard to point to just one. Okay, so I'm going to take, again, a little bit of black. In fact, that's even too much. Let's just put that to the side and just mix this. Maybe I'll just get a bit. Whoa, that's a lot more. Just a little black. Maybe I'll just do a little bit more because the other ones next to it maybe are a little bit darker. There we go. So this is my warm yellow, by the way. I think I was talking while I was doing that, so just pointing that out. Let's take a bit more black. I'm just going to get even more. That is interesting, seeing them all side by side. Huh. I definitely feel like that black, it's, I don't know what it is, this warm yellow, and this also, it's important to say that maybe could be different chemical compositions based on different paint companies. So like in an ideal world, you would do something like this for, you know, if you bought a whole bunch of tubes of paint and you plan on using them for a year or more and just like getting the most out of them, it might be a good idea to do all of what we're doing today in the last few weeks with those. No matter how far smart you are or advanced you are with painting, I think it would all be really, really helpful. Because you really get to understand how the chemistry of those different paints are working together. Take a bit of white, a little bit of yellow. I like that. Those are nice colors. Yeah. Whoa, that was a little bit too much. Let's put a bit more white back in here. And then let's just do one. Again, I didn't wash my brush. I'm just going to take that. So there's still a little bit of white on here. That's more than enough. So just slightly different. It's just got a bit more of an opaque quality. And again, the brush strokes disappear. So those are important things to pick up on. I mean, I guess, like, Susan, I'm just thinking other books. I mean, here's a book, Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green. This is a great book. This is probably the book that I read probably 20 years ago that really got my mind thinking about how everything I was taught was sort of, let me see, I'll just put that up here for a second more. Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green by Michael Wilcox. It got me thinking about color in just a much more complex way. I don't know if this would be a great book for a beginner, but certainly if you're getting interested in it like me, I think that might be, again, it might be a little bit more on the advanced side of things, but anyway, let's mix our gray here. Where should we put this? Down here. Made the mistake putting my yellow, cool yellow, into this gray last time, so. That's nice. I mean, once you've done like all of these, you almost have like a key to making whatever painting you want to make, because you just sort of look at it and go like, oh, okay. Well, I can just take a little bit of this color, take a little bit of this color. Just a little bit more warm yellow. We've got there we go. I know there's some blacks and whites here, but maybe I'll just do those afterwards all at once. Right, we just take a second just to to see what we've accomplished thus far. Okay. That's cool. So next we're going to be doing the we'll do the oranges and reds, because we now got blues, yellows, and then orange and red, because we got purple and green, which are our secondary colors. Okay. And potentially we could stop after the next one, but I might just keep on going, plow right through. So we want warm orange, warm red, and cool red. Does it matter which one we start with? I guess I got some warm yellow here, so let's put some more warm yellow in there. We'll do our warm red next. And maybe I'll just wipe away some of this paint and let it dry while I'm working elsewhere on this palette. You know, ideally I would just go and wash this in the sink rather than trying to do this here, but here I'm on camera trying to, so I'll just try to move as quickly as possible. Okay, so again, I've done this one. That was the first one we did. This is the second one I just completed, and this is the one I'm about to work on. So warm orange, warm red, and cool red. So maybe I'll just put this warm red right in the center here. Wow, still lots of people watching. That's great. I wonder how many people are actually doing this and how many people are just here zoning out on color. Whoa, dude. It's from the Muppets. What's that guy's name? It's like the bus driver or something? Hey, dude. Okay, so now I'm going to take my warm red. Let's take a little bit of black to make a shade. And again, it's interesting that black is making this go a bit cooler. All of a sudden, we saw that same thing here with our blues. Where was it? I felt like it was making, the black made that warm blue go a little bit cooler. So I see the same thing happening here. And that's entirely possible that this is the I don't know if that's necessarily a rule that we could carry over and say adding black to this, to a warm red, will make it cooler, because it's entirely possible that this black has, you know, it's not the most expensive paint, that it might have some properties in there that we might not see with a higher grade of paint. Tony says, you make it look so easy. Well, I've done this a few times. Both teaching and for my own uses. And okay, so take some white, and again, just a little bit of red. Whoa, look at that. We've got really bright. It's pink pretty quickly. Like, I mean, that's the thing. Let's take a little bit more white, a lot more red. Oops, that might have been a little too much, so let's just okay, I think I'm going to make a big batch of gray here that might hopefully last for the remainder of these paintings. So take this here, let's mix this up. Ah, I went a little darker than I wanted to. Okay. A little bit of red in here. Okay. Okay. Dr. Teeth. Is that the name of that character? Dr. Teeth. I wonder if, is that a play on, what's his name? Dr. That famous musician and, oh, 60s. The musician, there's a musician from the 60s, not Doctor Who, that keeps coming to my mind, but it's gonna drive me nuts now. Okay. So let's mix an orange here. I'm gonna take my Oops, I don't want to put it in gray. I hope I didn't contaminate it. We'll just see. Let's take this orange, or the warm yellow, and some red. Make it orange here. Again, I'm not going to obsess over making these colors perfect, because that's not really my intent or interest. It's just sort of being able to have a general impression of what the results will be using when we modify these values, right? What was it? Oh yeah, we're going to take this color. Why did I just wipe useful paint off of here? So I know I'm probably going a bit faster than most people doing this, but it also kind of shows, you know, we can do it at a relative speed here that is once you kind of get the ball rolling and you've done a little bit of it, it gets easier and easier. Oh, it's my curls. Whoa. Oh, it's my girl. Oh my gosh, you're so... Look how tall she is. You don't fit on camera anymore. Wow, nice pants. What are these for?
Just for fun.
Bell bottom. This looks like Little Mermaid costume here.
What, Iggy? Go say hi.
Hi. Oh,
To come say hi.
you're so tall. You're bonking your head on the camera there. Look at you.
He's got paint on his hand.
Oh, sorry. I know you want that paintbrush, but
We
probably a
just
bad
say
idea.
hi.
Oh, I love you, sweetheart. Say hi to everybody. Hi. She's like, why? I'm just looking at a camera. Awesome.
Bye, Daddy.
Wow, that makes my day. Okay, so where should I mix this? Let's do this right down here. A little bit of white. Just that. Oops. A little bit. Slight. Let's get more in here. And let's wipe this off. Donna says Dr. Hook. Yes, Dr. Hook. Dr. Hook is the name of that. I wonder if that's what that's about. That Dr. Teeth. That must be. Ooh, that's nice. Almost a little bit. In fact, let's just get lighten that up just a little bit. Dr. John. I think Dr. John is who I'm thinking of. You're right. Dr. Hook. That also sounds familiar too. I'm definitely thinking of Dr. John, but okay, our gray. I hurt. Okay, let's put this hopefully. Let's take a bit of orange in here. See, I didn't think, I thought this was good, would need more, then all of a sudden you paint it and you're like, whoa, that was more than enough. Let's mix it on the palette here. Maybe. So orange with just a little bit of green. Once again, very minor difference between those two, but again, there's just a little bit of that slightly pastel quality, whereas this, the black in the orange, just has a bit more of a dirtier kind of quality. It's almost, even though I don't see any pigment, I look at that and it feels grainy to me. These shades. That's just maybe the way I've always thought of them. Okay. Okay, let's get our cool red back on the palette here. Where should we do this? Right in here. It's pretty adorable. My daughter did not want to go back upstairs, just wanted to stay and hang out and paint. Watch. Okay. Now let's take a little bit, oops, a lot of black, not nearly that much. Got a little frog in my throat. Let's see if I can just clean this up a little bit. More black into this magenta or cool red. And then a little bit more black. Okay. Susan says, yes, this is a cool red. This is my magenta now. Okay. I'm going to take my white. Just a tad more red. One thing that occurs to me is that there could be also another reason to do that imprimatura is to cover up some of this carbon. I do wonder if I'm getting a little bit of the pigment from the carbon paper into my paint, and that could also be causing like an unknown little change in there. So it's worth sort of just mentioning that out loud, because possibly some people are like thinking about that at this moment. Ooh, those are nice. Nice colors, all side by side like that. I find that really helpful, because there's definitely times, you know, where I get a little bit confused sometimes when I'm trying to differentiate between a warm and cool colors, like I find it mostly between the reds and the blues, maybe a little bit less so with the yellows. Not sure why. Roxana says, she's gorgeous, Michael. I know, she's a heartbreaker. She was already breaking my heart daily. Okay, there's our gray. A little bit of our magenta. And then That is kind of interesting to me. Huh. How that happened. Oh, I wonder if I got a bit of blue from this dirty palette in there. That's possible. I mean, you could see it does seem to be a little bit more purpley than the others. That might have happened there. I'm not entirely sure. Okay, so that one I did kind of quickly, which might account for why it might not be as accurate. Roxana says, thank you, Michael. I have to sign off. I have an early day tomorrow. Have a great night, Roxana. And Heidi says, I was able to finish 2, but 1 behind Michael, as always. So we'll have to catch up after dinner. Thank you, Michael. Happy painting, everyone. Okay. Do I want to do one more? Let's do one more while I got the paints, and let's keep the truck rolling here. This one might be the... I have to even kind of think about how I want to approach this one. Just clean everything up a bit here. Okay, so what was I thinking here? Brownish-purple, cool orange, warm green. So but basically what I was thinking is using, rather than these colors, which is the result of mixing, let's say, warm orange or warm yellow and warm red to make a warm orange, instead make a cool orange using cool yellow and cool red, so something much closer to the neutral core, using a warm red and a cool blue, right, as opposed to the cool red and the warm blue to make these nice bright purples, and then using, let's say, warm yellow and warm blue to make a warm green, as opposed to this much cooler green on the outside, so much more desaturated color. So essentially mixing colors with, like, these types of colors with gray and white and black. Susan says, have you tried using baby wipes to clean the palette? That's probably a great idea, actually. The only reason why I'm not using water is that I think it'll just aggravate things. What I'm hoping is just the air dry, and then they just become dry entirely. Just to keep things moving as quickly as possible. Very smart, though. Very smart. And, you know, we do have lots of baby wipes in this house. Where should I go to next here? So which one? I've got warm red. Let's do warm red and cool blue. That's going to be a really dark color. We can do it. That's going to be interesting. So we don't need this warm red elsewhere, do we? It's just, yeah, okay. Because essentially this is close to the color that we would mix if we were making our own black. Sorry. So I'm going to take this warm red and cool blue, and look at this color. This is the purple that we get when we mix these two together, right? Not the most delicious purple of all. So I'm going to paint this purple up here. So it's got like it's kind of a maroonish kind of color. I can't remember who was saying that their purples were looking kind of maroon. So that kind of tells me probably we don't have a warm enough or cool enough colors, like a warm enough blue or a cool enough red to get a really nice saturated purple. Because I mean, look at the difference here between these purples, right? That's the difference between using our cool red and warm blue to make a purple versus warm red and cool blue to make that, right? Very different purples. Ostensibly they are both purple, but you know, some people would look at it and be like, I don't think that's purple. That's crazy. So what do we want to add? What am I doing here? Let's add some black to this paint. So here we're already very close to the neutral core. So the changes that we're going to see are going to be very minimal. I'm kind of expecting that this whole quadrant over here is going to be almost just a big black blob. But again, that is really helpful to see that, you know, there's not a lot. I mean, this gives us an idea of the difficulty that classical painters would have faced, right? There's, I mean, you're already painting when you're close to that neutral core with darker values. So okay, now let's I need some more white on here. Kind of in the middle, aren't I here? Oh, I'm not even on camera. Ah. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's get a gray going. Okay. Just need to mix a little bit more. Oh, this is my warm red, right? Just be careful. Get those mixtures right. You know, once again, we start kind of mid-range, kind of darker, and then gets lighter. Here with the shades, it gets kind of mid-range and gets darker. And then here, they're almost very similar values. Like, I bet you if we turned this black and white, which I want to do at the very, very end of today's episode, I bet you these are going to be all very similar, which I think is very interesting. In fact, I mean, it does look like it's a little bit darker and it's lightening up a little bit here, but that's also probably because, you know, the way that I mixed my gray is sort of just, you know, it's not 100% right in the middle of white and black. It's sort of changing every time I mix it, right? So it's not super scientific. Okay, so next up here is my cool orange. Tanya says, I love these colors personally. Yeah, it is like, it's kind of neat seeing, you know, some of these are colors that maybe some people off the top of their head don't think of as being particularly desirable, but I think are really beautiful colors. And they're also very classic colors. These are colors that we would see in colors in older paintings all the time. What would the tertiary colors, the tint tones and shades exercise be? Okay, so let's come back here. Tertiary colors, maybe just as so our so-called primary colors are, let's say, our warm red and our cool red, right? Technically a true primary, although it doesn't exist, would be right in between here, right? And then so same sort of thing. Here's our primary. This is a split primary palette, right? So we got a warm and a cool of each one, as opposed to trying to find this magical unicorn yellow that exists that is neither warm nor cold, right? And it's going to be one or the other. It's just might be very close to the middle, but not right on the edge. So we would have. So here's our two primaries. Here's our two primaries. Here's our two primaries, right? So our secondary color is what happens when we mix a primary together, right? So if we take our cool blue and our cool yellow, we mix it together and we get green, right? So that's our secondary color, right? This is a secondary, orange is a secondary color, purple is also a secondary color, right? So here we have, just like we have three primary colors, we have three secondary colors, and then our tertiary colors are the colors that are in between, right? So we have what we might call as a yellow orange, or a red orange, or a red purple, or a blue purple, or a blue green, or a yellow green. Those are tertiary colors. So we have 6 tertiary colors, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Now, of course, again, depending on how you mix your colors, they might be slightly different. And you could certainly do the same exercise with those colors, but then we're starting to get really, splitting some hairs, because, you're just talking about having a little bit more of a more reddish orange or more yellowish orange. I mean, we could that would be 2 more of these here, and I think the differences would be so minor that I don't think we would get much more out of them. But if you're certainly, it could be an interesting exercise for somebody who really wants to go all the way to the edge. So I'm trying to make a cool orange here. And what's going to happen, because I'm mixing these colors, so I'm taking my magenta, my cool red, and my cool yellow, I mix them together, and you might find it already kind of looks a little bit pale. It doesn't have the intensity, the strength of this color, right? So it's almost like, this is very interesting. It already sort of looks a little bit like as if I've tinted it. That kind of blows my mind. So, yeah, I would never, now, see, I'm learning here as I go, because I find this very, very fascinating. Look at that. I never would have thought of this as kind of having almost a bit of a tinted quality. Huh. I'm so glad I'm doing this final one here. Okay, so let's now, actually I'm just gonna make sure I got a nice mixture of it before I move on. Keep this as consistent as possible. Let's take a bit of our black again. Tiny, tiny bit of black. Whoa! Oops. Painting it in here. Let's keep on going with the black. Oops, that's maybe a little bit much. It definitely is behaving kind of like a gray. Okay. Okay, let's take our orange. Let's add a bit of, oops, I wanted to go the other way, didn't I? We'll split the difference. We'll start on one end and we'll go back the other way. So sometimes I do just like what I'm doing here is I was kind of mixing a little bit on the canvas itself. Like getting a little bit of paint on, it's a little bit too dark or too light, and then just dab my brush back into a bit of color and mix that onto the painting itself. I mean, that maybe could have been a little bit lighter, so I think I'm just gonna keep it like that. Let's go to our gray. You know what? I'm gonna mix some more gray right here. Cool. Those colors. Maybe not as they're not super desired colors, but they're pretty cool colors nevertheless. They could be very useful depending on what you're painting. Ravi says, "Thanks, Michael, for the explanation. Gotcha. All these group of 7 paintings have these dark palettes." Yeah, well, okay, so often, great artists tend to actually have fairly dark paintings that have bright colors within them, right? Again, that's a great use of contrast, high contrast of values. Having darker areas with pops of light, as opposed to having everything kind of in this mushy gray area. Great point. So my last one here is I wanted a warm green here. So that's my warm green. Is made using my warm yellow. And warm blue. And so here's the color I'm about to mix, my warm yellow and my warm blue. So instead of a really bright green, I'm going to get this much more grassy green, more brownish green. So we'll take our warm yellow and mix this blue into it. I think that might be, because again, we could make it much more of a blue or much more of a yellow. It's up to you. But I think I'm going to keep it like that. I mean, this is pretty close to like an olive green. Maybe if we added a bit more blue into it, I think we would get a little bit closer there. But if you're a landscape painter, you're probably wanting to use this green more than this green. I mean, you can see how just ridiculously bright and saturated this green is. It's not the most useful green. Even though we can get it, doesn't mean we necessarily want to use it, right? that was too much, but that's not bad. Just take a bit more. And then so we do kind of just end up getting a bit more of like a racing green when we add that black to it. Okay, we'll take our... I keep doing the same thing. Yeah. Okay, let's take our... do a little bit of white. We'll just mix it right on here. Go. And then for our final one, we'll take our gray. Still a little bit. I'm just taking a little bit more green and just pushing it onto the brush there. Very subtle transitions of colors here. In fact, I'm just going to take more of my green, paint it back over top. There we go. Okay, so just before I finish, I just want to mix another gray real quick. Do I need to get a little bit more white on there? got gray everywhere else. Okay. Okay. Tanya's signing off. Great. Thanks for hanging out for so long, Tanya. I do need some just unfiltered white. Susan says, it's really interesting to see the transition of all the colors. I found myself having that, what the look on my face. That is really cool. That's what's so neat about painting, how it just constantly teaches us new things. I've been doing this for 25 years, and it's still, every time I pick up a paintbrush, teaches me something new. About color, about the way that we see, or I see, about who I am. Pretty cool. Okay, so let's just move a bunch of stuff out of the way, and we'll take a look here, and then I'm going to convert all of this to gray so that we can just see. We can take little bets on what color you think is actually our brightest or lightest color. I mean, darkest color. Ooh. So let's can I get them all on the camera at the same time? Let's see. Kind of, looks like. Maybe I can zoom in a bit. Okay. Very cool. Seeing all of that together, I think, is really exciting for me personally, because we see a lot of there's I mean, I've been sort of talking throughout the episode of what I notice, but I think for me, you know, this one might be the most revelatory, just because these are all the colors deep within the color wheel. Right, so we have, maybe if I'll just sort of walk us around here. In the blues here, we've got our cool blue, our warm blue, and then a purple, right? That's what we're seeing right here. In the greens, what we have is our, we've got a green, cool green, right? Our cool yellow and our warm yellow, right? So warm yellow, and cool green. With our reds down here, we have our cool yellow, or sorry, cool red, and then warm orange. Right, so cool red, warm orange. And then over here, what we've got is our, let's see, we've got our purple here. I kind of call it like a brownish purple. It's more like a maroon. There's all kind of like more, they're I guess you could call them neutral, but they're either, I think of them as sort of moving one way or another away from the outer edges, so they're just desaturated colors. So we've got our purple, our orange, and our green here in this one here. So our purple, our orange, and our green. None of them have like a lot of saturation because they're away from the center of the color wheel. So I find all that really fascinating. Now let's give me a moment here. It's going to take me a second if I remember how to do this. Okay, let's see if that... There we are. That's our black and white. So, again, here, we've got purple, right? Maybe it's worth just... I'll get my color wheel out here. So here's this color, right? This is our purple. That's what we see right here. Here's our warm blue and our cold blue, right? That's our cold blue right here. We'll just move across here. This is our cool green, our cool yellow, and our warm yellow. Right, so our cool green, cool yellow, warm yellow. Here we have our warm orange, warm red, cool red. Warm orange, warm red, cool red. And then over here, we've got our kind of desaturated purple, neutral purple. Maybe I have to think of a word for that. Our cooler orange and our warmer green. So what are so you know, it's interesting. Look at these, you know, if I just trying to make these general assumptions, like our greens, a lot of people would say green is the darkest color on the color wheel. In terms of its value, I don't know. Maybe just the results I'm getting, I just don't find that my greens are quite that dark. I've always been surprised by that. That might just be a computer thing, maybe not on in terms of actual painting. You know, not surprising that all of these are where our darkest colors get, because that's where we're mixing our blacks. And it's also not that surprising that this is where our lightest values are, because this is where we're mixing in with white. I think what I'm surprised by is our grays, right? These grays in the center. Look how how little some of the values are, right? Here's our reds, and in our reds here, it's almost a big block of color. This is the one. Remember, people, I might have got a little bit of blue into this magenta, so that might have altered it, which might explain why it's all of a sudden a little bit darker, right? But you know, in here they're very similar no matter how much I change them. Here, one big block, if anything, they're getting lighter, which is, these are my blues, so they get lighter. That's all super interesting. I think it might be just while I've got this on here, my black and white, it might be worth just out of curiosity taking a look at a few other paintings that we've done over the past little while and just seeing how they look in the black and white light. So here's our Mondrian. Isn't that interesting? Right, that the Mondrian, this is red, blue, and yellow. That yellow looks like it's not that much different than the white. I find that kind of interesting. These are just paintings that I happen to have kicking around that I haven't done anything with. Here's the Edward Hopper Nighthawks painting, and we can see, you know, there's lots of color in here, but when it's converted to black and white, we still have a really strong contrast. Like this strong yellow inside, the radiating light outside, makes for a really, you know, dynamic composition, even when we convert it to black and white. Let's see, here's Van Gogh's. That's not surprising that this is going to be, there we have a nice contrast of value, but this is Van Gogh's skeleton with cigar. I want to do two. I kind of know, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, let's do a bunch of these. Actually, this could be interesting. Here's this Robert Indiana Love painting. Oh, that is interesting. So this is, you know, green, red, and blue, and yellow. I'm actually surprised at how very similar the red and the green are. And I remember when I was painting this feeling like they were a little bit close together and wanting a bit more contrast. But that would explain why I was not entirely satisfied here, because I would really want to have more contrasting values. Like, I think I'd want to have probably this green would be a little bit darker. So knowing that, I would probably then, so this is my green sheet, I could then go and say, how do I get this green to be even darker than it currently is? Well, I would probably want to add, I could add black to it, but what I would probably do is add maybe just a little bit of like red in here, just to kind of make it slightly more brown. Anyway, we could just keep on going over and over and over on all these paintings, but that gives us an idea. Like, you know, I've tried to reproduce the original, but because these colors were so intense, trying to match them is a little bit difficult. So this gives me an idea that when I'm mixing the colors, to try to go for a little bit more higher contrast. I just want to do a few more of these because I find it super interesting. Cornelius Krieghoff. What's another one? Kicking around here. Got tons of these things here. The Louis Wayne. So nice use of contrast there. Jean-Michel Basquiat. I got two of them here. Oh, I like that one. That's the Tanner painting I did for Thanksgiving. Again, really nice set of contrasts, right? Even though if we take out all the color, we still see like how nicely silhouetted these figures start to become from the background. Sanyu. Great contrast. Right, you start to see how like these great painters really used value to create differences here. Right, blue chrysanthemums. Somebody was asking me about this video a while ago. They couldn't find it, but there's Stuart Davis. So if anyone remembers me painting this one, I wasn't happy with those pinks. That's why. even if I wasn't even consciously aware of it at the moment, I wasn't getting quite the contrast I wanted. I think this is the color I remember eventually getting to, and then I just was like, let's just forget about it. But that pink there contrasts much better to this green. Anyway, I'll leave those there. Get a little butt show in there, butt crack. Okay. So, thank you everyone for painting along with me, and now that we understand a little bit more about how to mix a color wheel, how to use color temperature, and then now how to use color value and modify the values of color, we are really well set up to paint, right? And over the course of the next 2 months, we are going, 2.5 months, I think, we're going to be doing a bunch of very easy paintings anybody can do. I'm super excited for you to join me on that journey to get to know how to paint even better. I guarantee you, if you stick around and you paint with me for a little while, you're going to be a better painter than most of my students at Emily Carr, the university I teach at, are. Because most of them have never spent this amount of concentrated time learning some of these basics, these fundamental things that unfortunately even in art school they don't really teach that much of, because they just assume everybody knows how to do it. That's a whole other rant. I can go on about that. But and of course on Thursday we are going to be painting a bunch of more complex paintings, including a Leonardo da Vinci painting this Thursday. And on Saturday this week there's our feedback episode, so submit any of the painting, even maybe your color theory pieces here, color wheels, the value scales, and our color temperature studies, right? I'd love to see how those turned out. If you want to support the show, there's a PayPal link in the description below. You can send an e-transfer. You can even donate via the super chat function here in YouTube. I'm so grateful for all the donations that people have been giving, especially recently, all the new people that have been joining, so I appreciate your support, and that helps keep this whole train running. And you can also subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and then we'll see you in just a couple of days. So everyone, if you did all the work, you're well set up for the future. And join us as we go into the unknown. Good night, everybody. Take care. It's been fantastic painting with you once again.